This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Herbin Lierre Sauvage. I'll be testing this ink in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib, and I'm going to begin with the Pilot Extra Fine. It's in my Pilot 78G. This is a steel extra fine nib. And in this extra fine nib, Lierre Sauvage feels kind of scratchy. And it's not too dry. It's one of the wetter inks, but it does feel scratchy. It's unpleasant. All right, next I've got my Pilot Pereira with a fine nib. Again, it's a steel nib. Now this feels significantly better, but it's not scratchy, but it feels dry. I say that it feels dry because it's putting down a decent amount of ink, but the nib just feels dry on the paper. It's not scratchy, but it's not smooth either. Next, I've got my Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. Now this is smooth. This is very pleasant. Quite a bit wetter than the others. That was very enjoyable. I like that combination. Next is the Kaweco Perceo all black with a medium nib. A little bit of a hard start there, and I've noticed that with this pen and this ink. I wouldn't call this smooth, but it's pleasant. There's a little feedback. I'll say that it's nice. And now I've got the Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Very smooth. This and the Custom 74 were both very enjoyable to write with. Those are my two favorites so far. Next, I've got a Nemo Singularity with a 0.6 stub. And as usual, this 0.6 stub is just very enjoyable to write with. Puts down a nice amount of ink. Smooth, Always one of my favorites. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub. I don't use this 1.5 stub for everyday writing. I pretty much just use it for these ink tests, but I always enjoy. It's very satisfying to write with this really wide paintbrush of a nib. All right, while that dries, I'm going to take a look at a few other writing samples. I've got my little ARC notebook, and similar to the experience on the Tomoe River paper, the extra fine was scratchy. Now, it looks good, but it just felt scratchy. The Pilot Prera, again, was smooth but dry, so still not pleasant. Now, this paper's kind of thick and a little absorbent. Excuse me. So this Custom 74 that's quite a bit wetter than these two was smooth, but it was unpleasant because the ink was just soaking into the paper and spreading. It was just unpleasant because of the way the ink spread when it soaked into the paper. Now the Kaweco Perkeo, it was okay. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't like notably enjoyable to use. It was just okay, very usable. Now the Pilot Metropolitan was, I enjoyed it. I put that smiley face beside it. It was my favorite out of all of these. The Nemo sign was just a little bit too wet, too much ink, so the ink wanted to spread. Let's see. It didn't feather too bad. Let's see. And bleeding through, it looks like the 1.5 stub was really the only one that experienced any bleed through. Okay, on Rhodia paper, the 78G, I put that it was not scratchy, but it wasn't smooth and it wasn't enjoyable. It was just usable, but on this paper, it's a little too fine. It's not as legible. The extra fine and the fine, there's not a whole lot of difference in the way they look, and the fine just felt dry. The Custom 74, like on the Tomoe River paper, was nice. I really liked it. So I've got some thoughts. I'll talk about those later, I guess. The Kaweco Perkeo, you've got some nice shading, and it was smooth. The Pilot Metropolitan was smooth and enjoyable. The Nemosine, even though it was wetter on this good paper, was nice and smooth. Some nice subtle shading with the stub nib. So this ink is not the best if you're going to be using it with fine nibs, is my what I'm seeing here. 20-pound copy paper. This is not a great ink to use on poor quality paper. Now, one thing I did notice was the two finer nibs, look, they're more legible on this absorbent paper because the ink does spread out. They were nicer on this, surprisingly. The Pilot Metropolitan was also enjoyable to use. The wetter nibs just tended to be, the ink spread too much. So, on good quality paper, the wetter nibs are the better choice to go with, and on poor quality paper, perhaps the finer nibs. Let's see. On my Leuchtturm some nice shading. Just a very pretty green. And finally, going back to the Tomoe River paper. Ooh, I'm seeing some nice shading on this stub nib. That's pretty. And again, like I said, on good quality paper, the finer nibs, I would steer away from. A nice, if your fine nib is a nice wet fine nib and is a smooth fine nib, that would be okay. But on the poor quality paper, like copy paper, maybe go with the finer nibs. All right. Now, this is interesting because, let me see, where was it? The Aurora green and the Monteverde green worked well in a wider variety of nibs. Well, and those are, I take that back. Those are Western brands also. I was going to say this J. Herbin ink is better suited for like your wider Western nibs, like maybe Pelican, some of those nibs that are just really wet. Like my, my Lamy Gold nib is a really wet nib. This would be a good ink choice for that. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.